Hey, how's it going, everybody? Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to part 7 on a series where I show you how to build a simple modern habit tracker called consistency. So in the last video, we basically built the front end for this register component you can see here, and it has component state and Redux state, and we prepared to make the API call to the backend server. So what we're going to do in this video is basically do some error handling so that when a user submits a request like this, you get a whole bunch of errors that are sent from the backend. And if they enter everything correctly, they're redirected to the habits page. Oh, and just as a side note, a friend of mine, shout out to you, Omar, asked me a pretty logical question. He was like, why did you make the max length on your first and last names 25 characters? What if someone has a name longer than that? And to be honest, I didn't give it a second thought. It's just kind of an arbitrary number that just came to my mind. And that got me thinking. I was like, what actually is the longest name in the world? So I did a quick Google search and I found on the Guinness World Records website, the person with the longest name is 55 characters. That's pretty crazy. So right now my website is not going to support someone with that kind of name, and we can't be leaving out people like Roshan Diatelli. So let's just increase the maximum length for our first and last names to 60. And if the names are going to be 60, let's just make the email 100. And that got me researching what people usually make the max length on their passwords, and I found that to be typically 128. So let's just leave it at that. Anyways, let's continue. Now, as usual, I laid out the steps we need to do in order to complete this feature. The first thing we need to do is organize the routes on the backend file, because we're going to be writing a bunch of code and that's going to get messy pretty quick. So let's go to the backend into our server.js file. And basically we want to move this user route, and eventually we'll move the goals route as well. But we want to basically move these into different files. So in the backend folder here, let's create a new folder called routes. And in routes, we're going to create a new file called userroutes.js. Okay, to start, we're going to import Express. And we're going to use a function from Express that's going to let us create routers. So let's set const router equal to express.router. Okay, router is basically just a function from Express that's going to let us handle certain types of requests to URLs. All right, so to start off, let's take this post method from the server.js file and paste it into the user routes file. And we're going to modify it a little bit. So instead of app.post, we're going to use router.post because we're not using app here, we're using router. And at the end, we're going to export default router with a lowercase r. Let's also take this user slash from here, and you'll see why I'm taking that in just a second. So let's go back into the server.js file and actually use that router that we just created. So let's import user router or user routes from /routes/user routes. Okay, so to actually use this router that we just created, we're going to say app.use, and now we're going to specify an endpoint. So let's put /user here, because basically any request that is sent to /user /register /sign-in, whatever it is going to be handled by user router with an S. So now if we go into user routes, we have /register here. So basically if we have /user /register, it'll be handled by this function here. Let's go back to our React app and make sure that we still get the response that we had last time. So let's hit register, and we can see that for now, our server returns the logged in user with just a first name. But obviously we don't have any error handling yet, so let's do that. That marks off step 1. All right, so now the question is, how are we going to do error checking? You could use JavaScript and write a bunch of functions that check to see if inputs are empty and validate the email and make sure passwords match and all that stuff. But there's actually a library that makes our life a lot easier, and that's called express-validator. So this is what we're going to be using here. It basically handles everything for us. So let's copy this command here from their docs, go into our terminal, into the backend folder, and let's run that command. Okay, so now we have that installed. Let's go back into our user routes file and let's import some functions that we're going to be needing from express-validator. That's going to be body and validation result from express-validator. So according to the documentation, here's how these functions work. Basically, if you have a post request or any kind of route handler, you can put what's called middleware functions before your main handler function. All right, so here's where all the main logic is going to be happening, but we can run some extra logic up here. Basically, if you use the body function and you give it a string that has a field name, you can validate it using some sort of validator function. Here, we're checking if username is an email and if password has length minimum 5. And the way that we're going to store if any of those validations fail is through a function called validation result, which we pass the request and it'll return us any of the results that fail. So this is pretty much how we're going to do it with some slight modifications. So the way that I'm going to start writing this is, instead of writing the body validation functions directly before the handler function, I'm just going to put one function here and it's going to handle everything. So for example, we can put a function called user info validation, and this function will be called before the request is processed here. So since I'm going to be using this function to handle both registration and user sign-in, I'm going to give it a string to represent what fields I want to be error checking for. So in this case, I'm going to be checking for a register. Now let's write this function above. Const user info validation, it's going to be an arrow function. And like I said, it takes one parameter. And this parameter is going to represent what we're going to be error checking for. Let's put a switch statement so we can handle the different cases. So it'll auto complete that for us. And then we're going to be switching on the action. And then one case is going to be register. Let's get rid of this stuff. What we want to return here is an array that contains a bunch of different validations. The first one will be the validation for the first name. And what do we want to check for this? We want to check if, first of all, if it exists. And second of all, if the length is some minimum amount. Let's put minimum as 1. So to actually see how this works, let's use the validation results function and see what results we get after doing this error check. So just like we saw in their documentation, we can get a list of all the errors by calling that function and giving it the request as the parameter. After this, let's console log the results of error. All right, let's save this now and send a request from the front end and see what happens in our console. So if we leave the first name as empty and we hit register, all right, looks like I got a little error here. I just forgot to put some brackets after the exists function. So I can save that, send the request again, and go back to the console log. And now we can see that it's logging the error that we found in the backend. So we can see that we have a list with one object inside, and it says that the parameter first name has an invalid value. So that's good so far, but we can customize this even a little bit further. We can give it a custom error message as the second parameter to the body function. And for this one, we'll say invalid first name. Actually, let's say first name field missing. Okay, let's continue copying this down and handle the error checks for the other fields. So here we can do last name and say last name field is missing. Email, invalid email. So for this one, in addition to checking if it exists, we need to check the actual .is email function. And in the future, once we have our database set up, we can also check to see if this email is already in use. In other words, if the email already exists in our database. But for now, let's continue down and do the password. So for this one, we'll check if it exists and if its length minimum 5. And we can give it a message of password must be at least 5 characters. And lastly, we want to check to see if the password confirmation matches the password. So this one's going to be a little bit unique because we need to do 2 different checks. One is going to be the same as what we did exactly before, if it exists and if it's at least length 5. And second, we need to see if it matches the password that was entered before it. So we can leave this as is for now, but we can add what's called a custom error checker to this as well. So if you want to see more details about this, you can look in the documentation. But basically, if you put .custom, you can put your own logic of whatever you want to check for here. In this case, I want to create a function that checks to see if what's entered for password confirmation matches the password. So let's put a function here. And this function is going to take 2 parameters. The first one is going to be the actual password confirmation, which I'll just call this. And the second one is going to be the request object, because from the request object, we want to get this password field. And now we can put our logic in here, which is pretty simple. If password confirmation is not equal to request.body.password, then we can basically throw an error with a custom message. It'll say password confirmation does not match password. And if this check actually passes, then we can just return true. All right, I hope that's pretty straightforward. Now just to do a quick test, let's send another request from the front end and see what gets logged in the backend console. As you can see here, our errors list is pretty long because every field is missing, and so we got an error for every field so far. So this is good. It tells us that our error checking is working. So finally, all we need to do now in the request handler is one thing, and that's basically If this list of errors is not empty, then we're just going to throw a 401 error. So if not errors dot is empty, then we'll return response. We'll set the status code to 401, and we will send that entire list of errors from this variable. We need the dot array function, because if you look in the console, errors is actually a results object, and we need to access the array in the errors field. Okay, let's finally save this. And now at this point, if we do get any errors, it should get saved in the Redux state under the errors field for the register user state. So let's see if that actually happens. Let's hit register. And you can see that we got a rejected action dispatched to the store. And in the register state, our list of errors is full of everything that we expect, which is great. Now all we need to do is display these errors in the correct area on the front end. All right, if you're not too sure how to approach this, I highly encourage you to pause it here, spend some time, and see if you can figure it out. But basically, the process is this. First of all, we need to get those errors out of Redux and into our component. And to do that, we're going to use a hook that we've used previously, which is use selector. So let's first of all import use selector from React Redux. And then you can just say use select, and then it'll autocomplete the rest for you. So what state do we want to select? It's going to be the user state, which is state.user. And then from this state, we want to deconstruct the error field from user state.register state. All right, so now we have this list that contains objects which contain errors. All right, and basically what we want to do now is create some space underneath every label, find the correct error corresponding to that section, and display it there. So first of all, let's do error and. This will ensure that there's actually some stuff inside of the errors array. And now, before we do any styling or anything, let's just put a div and see if we can output the error correctly. So in here, we'll put some JavaScript. And before we write the quick logic for this, I just want to show you guys one more time what that errors list actually contains. Because if we look in the register state, we can see that it's a list that contains a bunch of objects, and each object has a parameter field. This is what we're going to use to keep track of what section to display the error in. And each section has a corresponding message, which is the actual error itself. So what we need to do in here is say error.find, because within the list, we need to find the correct object, and find basically takes some predicate, applies it on every element of the list. If any of them return true, it'll automatically return that element. So we're going to write a function here. It'll take one element from the error list, and if that element's parameter matches the string first name, then from that, we want to get the message. I hope you guys get the message. Let's send an error from here and see if it displays it. There we go. First name field is missing. Perfect. Now we just have to style this and repeat it for the other fields. But before we go ahead and copy paste this and change this string a bunch of times, I want to make this a little bit more efficient. Let's put this logic over here into a function so that we don't have to keep copy pasting this for every section. And the function that I'm going to write is called find error. It'll take one parameter, which will be the section name. So it could be first name, last name, email, whatever. And we'll pretty much just do this logic in there. So let's put const error object equal to, cut this stuff, put it here. And instead of having this hard-coded string of first name, let's just put section name, because we want to make this as general as possible. And for now, let's get rid of the dot message, because in the return, we're going to use that. So the thing is, it may or may not have found something inside of the errors list for this section. So what we're going to do is say error object, and we'll put a ternary operator. So if error object is not null, then we're going to return that dot message. But if it is null, then we don't want to return any object, and we'll just return null. This should be a colon. All right, so down here inside the div, we can just put find error, and in here we still have to pass first name because we have to specify what section we want to find it for. But the benefit is our code is a little bit more readable. Again, before we copy paste, let's just make sure the styling is good. So let's make this a styled component called error section, and let's write that above. It's pretty basic. All we want is for the text color to be red. And let's see how that looks. Great, so let's copy down for the other fields. And we can change these strings in here as well. Password confirmation. There we go. And let's see if it comes up for all the other fields. Awesome. So with that being said, there's some stuff that we can mark off the checklist. We finished using express-validator to validate the backend data, and we displayed the errors from the server onto the front end. The last thing we need to do is, if there aren't any errors, then we need to redirect the users to the /habits page. But real quick before we do that, I realized that my password confirmation field doesn't have a max length yet, so let's just put that there. And also, on the back end, some typos. This should be last, and the word confirmation should be after this. Okay, now let's continue. So, how do we redirect a user? First of all, remember that we actually have a property within the Redux state for register called logged in user. So basically, when this thing is not null, we should redirect them. So what's the first step to do that? Well, we need to get that logged in user state. So let's deconstruct logged in user from user state. And notice that I'm getting it from user state and not register state. Logged in user is one level above register state. Now, where do we put the check to see if this thing is null? The answer is in useEffect. UseEffect handles side effects. And if there's some value in this dependency array that changes, it'll run the effect. So what are we checking here? If logged in user, then redirect. Let's put logged in user as the dependency. And now the question is, how do we do this part? It's pretty simple. We can use another hook to help us do that. And that effect is called useHistory from React Router DOM. So let's import that. useHistory from React Router DOM. And we also need useEffect from React. So let's go back down here. And just before the useEffect, let's set const history equal to useHistory. And now this hook gives us access to a really cool function. So we can call history.push and just specify a path /habits. Okay, so let's save this and see if that redirection works. Again, if we have errors, it'll just throw them here like this. But if everything looks good, let's make this .ca. And awesome, it redirects us. So that's pretty much the behavior we want. Also real quick, I forgot to add history as a dependency to the array in useEffect. And in user routes, we can also get rid of this console log. And that'll check off the last thing for this video. So notice that we haven't yet saved any users to the database. So the next video is going to involve two major concepts, and that is password encryption and setting up the database to store our users in. So I hope you guys continue to follow along as I build out this project, and hopefully you guys learned something from it. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next part. Bye.